I would like to introduce our speaker for the evening. She told me to make this very brief, so I will. It is Dean Laura Ann Rosenbury. She's the current Dean of the University of Florida. I have her CV here. It's very impressive, as you can imagine. She went to Harvard Radcliffe College, was awarded summa cum laude in Women's Studies in 1992, went to Harvard Law School and graduated in 1997. Has done a number of scholarly presentations, scholarly papers, books, articles, and essays. I thought one of them that was especially interesting was called, let me find this. She probably knows which one I'm going to mention. Friends with Benefits, question mark? And I did flip through it, and it was very interesting. It was a number of pages, so I didn't finish it, but that was one that caught my attention. But she clerked for Judge Carol Bagley Amon in Brooklyn, New York, Eastern District of New York, U.S. District Court in 97-98. She was a law clerk to Judge Dennis Jacobs, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit in New York from 99 to 2000. She was an associate and then went right into teaching. And some of the schools that she's taught at, either on more of a temporary basis, are Fordham, Stanford, University of Chicago, UCLA, University of Illinois, and Harvard. And she's been at Washington University Law School for a while. She started as an associate professor of law, then became a professor of law, was also a research professor, became vice dean in 2010, from 2010 to 2012, and University of Florida was fortunate enough to snatch her in 2015. So she's been dean there for 2 years now. So without further ado, I'd like to present Dean Rosenbury to speak to our end.
Thank you so much for that very kind and generous introduction. It's a real honor to be with all of you tonight. It's my first time in Manatee County, and I greatly appreciate the invitation to speak with you. It's also so great to see so many of you just a week after Hurricane Irma. As you just heard, I've only been in Florida 2 years, so Irma is the first major hurricane that I experienced. And of course, when you hear about Florida across the country, it almost always involves the Florida man meme. This idea that any crazy news story circulating on the internet must involve Florida. But what you don't hear often enough is how the people of Florida stand together in the most trying times. And over the last 2 weeks, I've seen countless volunteers, neighbors, first responders, and emergency service personnel from all walks of life helping each other in Gainesville, where the university is located, but also I've heard stories from across the state from our alumni, and it's just so impressive. And I hope all of you have started to get back to normal and to recover after Irma, and that your loved ones were not too greatly affected. I've really enjoyed being the Dean of University of Florida these past 2 years and 2.5 months. Florida's flagship law school, being the best law school in the third largest state, is a really exciting place. And I'm really proud of the strides our law school has made over the past 2 years. The Culver House Challenge was a very exhausting yet exhilarating experience over 14 weeks this past summer. I'm also really excited that our overall ranking in U.S. News and World Report has gone from 48 to 41, and I'm confident we'll be in the 30s next year. The credentials of our incoming classes have become better and better. We have provided more scholarship support for students so they hopefully will graduate with less debt. And our faculty is producing scholarship that advances important debates both in the legal profession and in public policy arenas. And I particularly want to thank all the alumni in the audience tonight. I've met a few of you, but can the Gators raise their hands? It's so great to meet you, and I hope we'll have more time to talk afterwards. And I'm so thrilled that two of our most recent grads, Lindsay and Bergelina, could also be here today. It's the alumni, all of you. You are the reason we are able to do such amazing things at UF Law. Your support, your guidance, and your investment of time, talent, and treasure is so necessary if we're going to continue our rise and become one of the nation's top 10 public law schools. So my objective as dean is to strategically position the law school so that our students, our faculty, and our recent graduates will follow the lead of all of our other graduates and continue to move not just the school forward, but to move the state and the nation forward. And so that brings me to the main reason why I'm here tonight, to talk about implicit gender bias, which I understand is not often an easy topic for lawyers to talk about. And of course, we've made a lot of progress, though the progress has been slower than some must like. Women of all colors are becoming more represented at various levels of the legal profession, from deanships to managing partners at large law firms to judges throughout the ranks. Women are also taking more leadership roles among our clients, from Fortune 500 companies to tech companies in Silicon Valley to our local business and other community organizations. So even though we've made progress, I want to make sure that you know I'm not wearing rose-colored glasses. Women still face barriers and bias on this road to leadership, on this road to advancing in all of our organizations. In fact, the National Association of Women Lawyers just released a study that has some very sobering statistics. So, of the equity partners in law firms across the country, only 17% are women. Of all equity partners, only 17% are women. Only 2% are women of color. And only 1.6% of these equity partners are African American, whether male or female. And to go even deeper in this somewhat depressing situation, among the equity partners, where we only have 17% women, the median male equity partner makes about $46,000 more than the median female equity partner. So we have a problem with numbers, and we have a problem with parity of compensation. And the Florida Bar also recently did a study amongst Florida Bar members which confirmed some of these statistics. Particular, it found that 1 out of every 25 male lawyers had been harassed or bullied due to their gender at work. 1 out of 25 male lawyers. When we look at female lawyers, that number jumped to 1 out of 7 female lawyers who have been harassed or bullied because of their gender at work here in the state of Florida. And I think implicit gender bias is perhaps the most insidious barrier contributing to these statistics. And it's so insidious because it's not overt. Instead, it's subtle or unconscious. So Gone, for the most part at least, are the days when, overt sexism ran rampant in offices. Don Draper and his madmen have put down their whiskey for the most part. Those days are over. But there's still this lingering implicit bias. And so tonight I want to outline some steps for how we can begin to talk about the bias and then also combat it, to develop strategies to overcome it. Now, as Dean of UF Law, among all my other duties, including raising money, recruiting great students, finding them great jobs, and retaining a great faculty, in addition to all of those duties, I've also tried to make tackling gender bias an important component of my job. And some of you may have seen that it's gotten me in a bit of trouble, particularly around this time last year. And that was not a great time. But I've come to the conclusion that if I, as the dean of Florida's flagship law school, and a professor with specific expertise in gender and law, cannot bring these issues to the floor, then how can I expect any of my current students or young associates at law firms to identify and challenge gender bias? I have a prime perch from which I believe I have a duty to engage with the legal community in these conversations. And of course, a young Gator Law alum, just starting her career, has the reverse power dynamics. So I am so honored that Judge Malucci invited me to speak tonight on this very topic. So what does the research show about gender bias? Psychologist Susan Fiske, who's a tenured professor at Princeton, has revealed that people universally use 3 dimensions to judge all leaders. So these are trust, relationship development, which is also called warmth as like sort of a shorthand, and then competence. Okay? That's pretty intuitive. What's not so intuitive is the finding, repeated over and over in studies, that female leaders must generally show more warmth than male leaders. Indeed, if female leaders do not overperform in this warmth category, if they don't really put it on, they are often seen not just as cold, but they're also seen as untrustworthy and incompetent. They lose on all 3 categories if they aren't sufficiently warmth. So they have to go above and beyond in the warmth category in order to succeed. At the same time, there's a double bind. If women are seen as overly warm, it undermines perceptions of our competence as leaders. So we have to overperform warmth, but we have to make sure we don't go too far. Because if we go too far, we're then seen as soft, unable to take action without input, and reliant on others. So that's the double bind. And in contrast, male leaders are generally seen as plausible and effective so long as they meet a minimal threshold in each category. They don't have to overperform at any one. And I would say you clearly don't need to be a professor at Princeton to see how this dynamic played out in last year's presidential race. So, given these studies, this reality, how might we move forward, both on the national stage, but more importantly in our own organizations, our own law schools, law firms, legal communities, and in our own lives? I will say one tempting solution is to treat gender or race or other aspects of identity as a distraction that we can just ignore in order to move forward. And I'm sure we've all thought that if I work hard enough, if I just put in the time, if I work hard enough, people will see the value of my work regardless of gender or identity. And indeed, that's a really comforting thought. I felt it many times. It helps us feel in control and not at the mercy of these gender or race stereotypes. But studies consistently show that willful blindness, if you will not change dynamics that are deeply ingrained in our minds and in our societal structures. Pushing aside gender might initially feel empowering. I can tell you, I often was annoyed when I was introduced as UF's first female dean. I wanted to be the dean, not a female dean. So pushing aside gender can feel empowering, but it does nothing to change the ways that gender continues to influence perceptions of leadership and competence, as Professor Fisk has pointed out. And this is whether we want those perceptions to be there or not. They will be there. We can't will them away. Because these studies consistently show that gender dynamics, both at work and in society at large, alter how other people perceive women's contributions and women's worth in organizations. Now, these dynamics differ among women. There is no one essential woman. The differences are based on differences of age, race, sexual orientation, geography, nationality. But the dynamics are still there in different forms. And all of us have to be aware of how such dynamics affect perceptions of women's worth and develop strategies to manage them. So instead of ignoring gender and identity, we must recognize and discuss the subtle and pervasive effects of bias, much like we are today. And that can be empowering because it enables us to strategize and take action. And I want to emphasize, though, that that action must consist of something more than insisting that other people change. It's easy once you begin to read these studies and become more aware of implicit bias to just insist that other people get with the program. And there's sometimes a place for that, but in fact, the studies show that that attitude can often reinforce the bias instead of challenging it. Simply pointing out bias isn't enough to eliminate it. In fact, it can reinforce it. So, what are some effective strategies? I'll spend the rest of my time discussing 3 that are particularly designed to help women advance in organizations and lead despite this ongoing implicit gender bias. But I want to emphasize that these 3 strategies are likely useful for everyone at work, not just women. But they are particularly useful for women because of the gender dynamics that the implicit bias research reveals. So what are the 3 strategies? The first is to understand the importance and role of sponsors and develop a strategy for getting sponsors in your career. The second is to increase our ability to think creatively about gender and how it plays out in negotiations, self-promotion, and gaining influence among communities. And the third is to embrace the unwritten rules of organizations and to embrace being strategic. Okay. So, the first, sponsors. I'm sure all of you have had mentors in your life, and you probably are serving as mentors to other people, whether they be young law firm partners, law students, high school students, you name it. And mentorship is vitally important, but I want to emphasize the difference between mentorship and sponsorship. Sponsors are of a different category than mentors. Sponsors are people who help you get to the next level in your career by putting their own reputation on the line. These are people who have skin in the game and provide you with active support to get to the next level. They advocate for you, they protect you, they fight for your advancement. And they do that by leveraging their own power and reputational capital. So, have people heard of this difference between mentors and sponsors before? A few of you. So, a few of you probably have sponsors and are striving to get more of them. The studies show that it's sponsorship that's key to advancement, at least in large organizations. And the studies also tend to show that men have more sponsors than women. So if women want to compete, we have to level this playing field by getting more sponsors. So how do you get sponsors? Well, of course, you can seek them out directly and say, hey, I need a sponsor. And you can build your network and develop ties by joining organizations like this one. But it's often more effective to find sponsors indirectly through stretch assignments. So these are work opportunities that broaden your scope, empower you, force you out of your comfort zone, and increase your knowledge, skills, and expertise, and your visibility. And if you take on these stretch assignments and succeed, the person who you helped will feel more likely to take you on in a sponsorship role. Now, the problem with this indirect strategy of getting sponsors, this stretch assignment strategy, is that women often don't ask for stretch assignments. There are studies that show that if a job description lists 10 criteria for the job, men on average will apply if they have 4 to 5 of the 10 criteria for the job. They'll say, oh, that's close enough, I'm going to put my hat in the ring. Women, however, wait till they have 9 or 10 of the qualifications before they apply. So we hold back from taking on stretch assignments because we think we're not ready. And I've often used the story from a friend of mine who's now a professor at Cornell Business School. She's an organizational psychologist and an industrial psychologist. Her name's Professor Michelle Duguid. And she was trying to get at this notion that oftentimes men and women have different competencies. And she was at an event like this, and she, in order to identify ways that women might have unique competencies, asked the room, and it was split about 50-50, how many people were experts in breastfeeding. Okay? But she was surprised when almost everyone who raised their hand was a man. It was like a failure in her talk. And afterwards, there was a cocktail hour, and she went around asking both men and women either why they identified as an expert in breastfeeding or why they didn't. And so the men who had raised their hands said things like the following: well, my wife breastfed our 4 children, and I watched her all those years, so I think I'm an expert. Another man said, well, I watched a documentary on breastfeeding, and I watched the whole 2 hours, and I now am an expert. And then finally, one man said, well, you know, I was breastfed, so I assume it's intuitive, right? She then asked the women, well, why don't you identify as an expert in breastfeeding? And the women said things like, well, yes, I breastfed my 2 kids, but I only did it for 6 months each, and I probably should have done it for 2 years, and I know people who have done it much longer, and they're the experts, I'm not. Or, well, I did breastfeed, but I had trouble latching, and therefore I had to go to a lactation consultant, and I just, there are so many other people who are more expert than I am. Those are the dynamics that I'm trying to get at when I say women often don't ask for stretch assignments or put their hat in the ring for stretch assignments because we think we're not ready. Of course, the women in that room, most of them, were experts in breastfeeding. They had experience, direct experience, not just watching, but actually breastfeeding. And yet they didn't identify as experts. So instead of focusing on what we don't know, we have to put ourselves out there and ask for assignments even if we feel we're not fully ready. And then, of course, we have to execute well, and that helps build the relationships of trust that lead to sponsorship. And I certainly would say that this is how I became a dean. It was through two key sponsors in my career, including the most recent dean at WashU for whom I worked, who then went on and became the president of University of Syracuse in New York. And when I was interviewing for the UF job, the president and provost of UF called him up for a reference. And he later told me that they talked for about an hour and a half, going back and forth on my qualities and what would make me a good dean. And Kent, for whom I had worked, knew my strengths very well, but there were still some concerns. I'd never been a dean before. Some people perceived me as young. And finally, Kent, my sponsor, said the following: look, if you hire Laura and she is not the absolute best dean you've ever had, then I will personally come and clean all of the toilets at the University of Florida. And Kent Fox, the president of University of Florida, tells that story as the turning point when they decided to give me the job. That is one example of a sponsor. So sponsors are key to overcoming some of the bias that women might otherwise face. Bias that they're not quite ready for big assignments, bias that they're not quite ready to lead. Sponsors can help you get over that hump. Second strategy is really paying attention to the role of gender, and particularly how it plays out in negotiations and self-promotion. So research shows that women often experience backlash when they violate gender role expectations and act in supposedly masculine ways. So, if women are too masculine, we're seen as difficult to work with. But if you're perceived as too feminine, then you're often viewed as incompetent. It's this double bind again. So we have to find ways to work around these dynamics and mediate the backlash, sort of blunt the backlash. So, with respect to self-promotion, women often receive pushback when they stand up and talk about their contributions in a court. Hopefully that is a warm and friendly environment. But in other contexts, particularly work contexts, studies show that women are often punished if they self-promote, if they said, well, I achieved this great thing last week. And also, women often find it uncomfortable to self-promote. It's just not something we like to do. But it is essential. People need to know your worth. They need to know what you have been doing if you are going to climb that ladder. And women in the workplace often have a tougher time getting credit in collaborative efforts than men do, unless they engage in this active self-promotion or other forms of promotion. So a recent study of economists going up for tenure at universities reveals this. The study looked at men and women who had co-authored papers and whether those co-authored papers would be seen as counting toward their tenure. And the study showed that women who co-authored papers with men were much less likely to be granted tenure and promotion. In contrast, the men who co-authored the papers with women were more likely to be granted tenure and promotion. So the same paper could lead to different outcomes for the two authors. So not only do women find it problematic to self-promote or take credit, But those in the position to make promotion decisions also assign more credit to men. So what do we do with these dynamics? I mean, it's easy to just get depressed and want to put your head in the sand. But the research shows that there is a very effective solution, which is to form a group of men and women to celebrate one another's accomplishments. This is what I call the posse solution. If you get a posse together at work, you can promote each other's accomplishments without having to engage in self-promotion. And of course, this is effective for both men and women, but it particularly helps eliminate that backlash that women often receive when they personally engage in self-promotion. So not only do people learn about your accomplishments through this posse strategy, but you avoid getting penalized as a self-promoter. And some would say you also feed into, this notion that women should be more selfless and communal because you're promoting the accomplishments of others. Negotiation is similar. We all have read the studies that women don't ask, and that is part of the story. But the part of the story that gets less press is that women generally tend to be punished when they do ask, right? So there's a reason why women aren't asking, because they understand the dynamics and they don't want to make things worse. Why are women punished? Well, it's because of these stereotypes of women as needing to be selfless and more attuned to others' needs rather than their own. And so asking for something for yourself as opposed to for a client is often seen as a mark of ambition, which can be admirable in men, but often makes people nervous in women. So what do? Simply asking isn't going to overcome this potential backlash. There are 3 strategies that the literature consistently highlights, and I have used myself, including I've used 2 of them in my negotiations with the president of UF before I became dean. The first is to say that you're negotiating for the team, not for yourself. Okay, so in my case, the provost gave me my initial offer to become dean. It was actually quite generous, but I study negotiation and gender, and I knew it would not be living what I preach if I just accepted that first offer. So I did some research, and I came back to him with another number. But before I did that, I called the chair of the hiring committee, the interim dean, and a few other professors at the University of Florida, and I said, this is the salary that they've offered. What do you think? And each of them said something like the following: the University of Florida strives to be a top 10 public law school. If the University of Florida wants to be a top law school, it has to pay its dean a top salary. And therefore, you should ask for more. And so that's what I told the provost. Yeah, thank you for your very generous offer. I would like you to consider a higher amount, because if you want me to come in and make Florida a top public law school, we need to signal to the world that we are paying deans and faculty members top dollar. And you can go look up my salary. I'm a public employee. I didn't get the entire amount I asked for, but I got it. Some, right? And it's because I said, this is not just for me personally. It's not just so I can buy a great car or whatever. This is to help the university move forward. Another strategy is to blame your ask on someone else. And I sort of did that too. You say, well, the interim dean said I should ask for more, right? Right? Or my supervisor said I should ask for more. right? So if you blame it on someone else, that also sort of blunts any concern that women are being overly ambitious or selfish. And one final strategy is you can negotiate while expressing concern for social relationships. So you can say something like, my team really needs this, but I am concerned that John may have an issue with it. How can we address his concerns while we're providing my team with more money, right? So just acknowledging the dynamic can often help blunt it. So this gets me to the third point, and I want to emphasize that some of this advice may seem contradictory. So, the studies show that women need to be assertive, but not too assertive. We need to transcend gender stereotypes while also playing into them, possibly at times. But these contradictions bring me to the last point, which is the importance of understanding unwritten workplace rules and norms. So women are actually often better at understanding unwritten rules and norms because the research shows that women on average, not all women, but women on average have higher emotional intelligence, or the EQ. But at the same time, the other studies show that women really like to follow the written rules. We're rule followers, particularly female lawyers. And we're often uncomfortable putting those written rules aside to follow the unwritten rules. So another way to frame this is that women often resist being strategic. We think, well, if we play by the rules, we'll get ahead. We want to think that, if we put our heads down, just work hard enough, everything will be fine. But research shows we need to put those concerns aside. We need to just push aside our concerns that being strategic is somehow unseemly, and instead be strategic about discovering the unwritten rules. And we often have to work harder to find them because they're often passed down in informal channels, the golf course, at the bar, or even the men's room, right? So we have to work behind the scenes to figure out the unwritten rules. And we can do that because many women are perceptive and good at forming relationships. But it can be daunting to just think of this general category of unwritten rules. So here are 4 ideas that I share with students for unlashing what I call the inner political being. The first is to pay attention to the ways people speak and adopt their style when appropriate. This is particularly important in a hierarchical relationship. So if your boss or client emails, you email them back. Likewise, if they call, you call them back. You don't send them a text. Mimic the culture of the client, the culture of the organization. It's a way to pick up on these unwritten rules. 2, figure out who the decision makers are. I say this to the 1Ls over and over and over. Figure out who is the decision maker, the real decision maker, and then in what voice do they speak? What will be compelling to them? 3rd, strategically ask for feedback. Not just asking what you could do better, but asking what you did well. And 4th is to develop a growth mindset. By doing what I call a small win strategy, where you say, today I'm going to try this. Hopefully you'll succeed, but if you don't, you fail fast and forward and you try something new. That means not beating yourself up, but instead picking yourself up and getting back in the game. And I want to close by saying, don't let anyone tell you that female leaders aren't bold. There might be this myth out there that women play it safer than men, but the studies show that men aren't bolder than women. In fact, it shows the opposite, that women make bolder leaders in almost every area of management, especially in male-dominated areas of business. So why is this? It's because women tend to show, at least at these levels, a greater willingness to challenge the status quo, to push harder for results, and to do something out of the ordinary. So will each of these strategies, finding sponsors, mediating gender backlash, and learning unwritten rules, will they make gender bias disappear? Absolutely not. But they're ways to begin to acknowledge, discuss, and combat the gender dynamics that undermine female leaders and keep that percentage of equity partners, female equity partners, so low. And I firmly believe that it's only by acknowledging these dynamics and discussing them and working creatively with them that we will move forward. And so it's been an honor to address you today, and I look forward to hearing any questions you may have. Thank you. Any questions? If not, I'm happy to talk informally afterwards. Thank you so much.